Hey everyone, thank you for joining us. We'll give it just a couple of seconds to let the audience file in. Okay, well, I am going to go ahead and get started. Good morning. Thank you for joining us for Preparing for a World Where Carbon Has a Cost. We will be discussing why carbon pricing and other sustainability measures and legislation affect your business now. I'm Carrie Dillon, the Managing Director of the International Textile Alliance, or ITA. The ITA is a nonprofit business association whose members include textile mills, leather tanneries, trimmings manufacturers, and suppliers that support our industry. We have an educational foundation focused on bringing new talent into the industry and educating our members. And we are also the producer of the recently rebranded trade show, now known as Interwoven. Our next Interwoven event will be on May 22nd through the 25th. Please visit our new website at internationaltextilealliance.org to register to attend the show. To give you a quick overview of the format for today's presentation, we'll start with a brief introduction and then move into current and future carbon regulations, followed by putting an internal price on carbon. And then we'll address near-term sustainability actions, followed by a question and answer. So again, welcome to the first webinar in a series focused on issues of sustainability, but reframed. We have all heard about sustainability being important because we should do the right thing for our planet, and we should. But it has become increasingly more apparent that there is both a benefit to addressing these coming challenges to our businesses and an important factor of proactive planning and risk avoidance in our bottom line budgeting and strategy, now in the immediate and for long-term planning element of your business. It's our goal as the ITA to help educate our membership on the landscape of what is happening with these changing elements. This allows you to plan for evolving potential costs to your business and get ahead of them. And there are benefits to doing this. For a few years now, studies have shown that there is a clear cost benefit to making physical changes to manufacturing and operational elements of your business. For example, changing to green energy can pay for itself in a short time frame and will save in the longer term as well. Companies changing to all electric shipping fleets are seeing the long-term advantage of the investment in these energy efficient vehicle switchovers now. Another benefit is that consumers want to do business with brands that have a sustainable and transparent story. Being sustainable builds brand loyalty. It builds brand equity. And in turn, brand equity extends to employees and retention. Employees want to work for companies who share their values. In this day and age where it's hard to keep employees, it is important to understand that sustainable brand practices are critical to building employee loyalty. These benefits are intriguing, but there are growing reasons to be planning for a future where not being sustainable may have a cost. From a 2022 Deloitte study on climate change, 97% of companies have felt the impact of climate change, including operational and supply disruptions, regulatory uncertainty, and increased employee anxiety. Stakeholders increasingly expect executives to address climate change, with pressure coming from regulators, boards, customers, shareholders, and employees alike. Nearly 70% of consumers in the US and Canada think it is important that a brand is sustainable or eco-friendly. That's according to a new study by IBM and the National Retail Federation. The research polled about 19,000 customers from 28 countries, ranging from Gen Z to baby boomers, to find out how individual shopping decisions are changing. North American respondents, which numbered 3,500, increasingly prefer sustainable brands. 69% of environmentally conscious buyers willingly pay a premium for recycled products, and more than half of these buyers are ready to change their shopping habits to reduce negative impact on the environment. Additionally, putting a price on carbon drives emissions reductions while helping grow the economy, creating and protecting jobs. And while there are many reasons for businesses to care about sustainability, one of the drivers is that carbon increasingly has a cost. That's the purpose of this presentation today. What can you and your company do now to ensure that your business remains resilient in the face of climate change? So our speakers from Agendi are here to tell you. I am pleased to introduce them. Kevin Furtick is a senior consultant located in Brussels. Kevin has a background in environmental consulting, law, and international trade. He has experience in conducting greenhouse gas inventories, drafting GRI, CDP, and TCFD reports, and developing corporate engagement tools. If you don't know what those reports are, you will soon. And is an expert in climate mitigation strategies and deforestation. We also have Avatar Simpson, who is a sustainability consultant in New York. Avatar has experience in greenhouse gas accounting and management, practice in developing annual sustainability plans and GRI reports, and knowledge in climate change mitigation and adaptation strategies. And then we have Milena Lefebvre, a sustainability consultant in London. She has experience in project management, sustainability communications, and strategy. She specialized in sustainable fashion and circular cities, and has expertise in carbon offsetting, sustainable reporting, and disclosure. And so I will ask that everyone, if you have questions, if you could please put them in the Q&A section. The deck will be shared with you following the presentation, but again, any questions you have throughout, please put them in the Q&A, and we will address those at the end. And so now I'm going to turn this over to Kevin.
Sure. Hi, everyone, and thank you all for joining us. And thank you, Carrie, again, for the introduction. It's very clear from our experience and from yours that there are a lot of drivers that bring companies to begin to care about sustainability from a business perspective as well. And so, again, to introduce myself and my colleagues, my name's Kevin. I'm based in Brussels. Avatar is one of our senior consultants based out of New York, and Milena is a senior consultant based out of London. We are, as you can imagine, a multinational environmental consulting firm. We've been operating for a few years now, and help clients of all sizes with all steps of the sustainability journey. So whether you're just starting out and looking at integrating sustainable programs within your company for the first time, or you've been already responding to stakeholder expectations for several years and are looking to take the next step to become a leader within your industry, we have a range of solutions and a range of engagements that help companies work through whatever their needs are, whatever issues they're currently facing in terms of sustainability strategy, disclosure, and impact. And with that, I would like to move on to the next slide. And I'll hand it off to my colleague Milena to talk about, first and foremost, carbon pricing, what it means, what the extent of it is today, and why it matters to the textile industry.
Thank you, Kevin and Carrie, for providing context to why these discussions are so important and why the textile industry should be taking action in these trends and get ahead of the curve. So I'll now talk about current and future carbon regulations and what it actually means for the textile industry. But first, what is carbon pricing? So carbon pricing is a regulatory tool to shift financial incentives for companies to really integrate greener initiatives, usually in the form of a price on carbon dioxide emitted. So basically it's like a fee on emissions, and it increases in time, and often it's set at a regional or national level. So it's just a way to really encourage polluters to reduce their emissions and to really promote the use and development of low carbon technologies. So there are two main types of regulated carbon pricing. The first one is the emission trading scheme. In the US, you might have heard it as like cap and trade. And so the emission trading scheme, it's a cap on yearly emissions that companies can emit. The companies, they will have like a fixed number of emissions allowances. However, it is possible to trade the allowances and buy permits from companies that emit less and actually have too many allowances for the amount of emissions that it actually emits. So all like companies that are under the emission trading scheme has to cover all their emissions with allowances. Otherwise, they have to pay like serious fines. Then the second type is of regulated like carbon pricing is like a carbon tax. And that one is more a cost per ton of CO2 that is emitted rather than a cap on all emissions. And there's two broad forms under the carbon tax. One is an emission tax, which is more based on the production, well, not on production quantity, it's more like on the total emissions resulting from your production quantity. And then there's a tax on goods and services, which is there more specific to products that are, for example, greenhouse gas intensive, such as gasoline. So what's important is that in both carbon pricing types, the fee on emissions is really set to increase as the reduction on emissions will also augment with time. And as we can see on the next slide, carbon pricing initiatives are already like quite prominent across the globe. And they covered around more than a third, more than a fourth, sorry, of like the globe total emissions. And with so many like carbon pricing initiatives out there, we have made like a small selection of those that would actually be the most relevant to the attendees of this webinar. And we will not like cover all of them. So if we start with the first one, which is also the oldest one, is the EU emission trading scheme. And that one puts a cap on like power sectors, energy intensive sectors, and also aviation. Then we have China that launched last year a carbon emission trading scheme on the thermal power industry. And then we have in the US, two emission trading schemes, the RGGI, which covers a lot of like the northeastern states and focuses on the power industry, and the Western Climate Initiatives, here written under WCI. And that one covers the American states of California and Washington, but also the Canadian provinces of Nova Scotia and Quebec. And that one has a cap on all sectors. Then on the other side, regarding carbon taxes, we have Mexico and Argentina. They both have a carbon tax on emissions from energy use. And then we have Singapore, which has a carbon tax that's applied on all the sectors. And there's an upcoming one in Indonesia that will be on coal-fired power plants. So even if like most of these schemes are not yet regulations that directly affect the textile industry, the costs of these schemes are passed on indirectly, such as through elevated electricity bills. It's also quite important to keep in mind that eventually these schemes will cover the textile industry, as the schemes are just set to include more sectors and more industry over time. And if we take, for example, the EU emission trading scheme, it started with only covering emissions from power generators and energy intensive industries. And it then expanded to also include the aviation industry. And also more countries actually joined the scheme. And also the penalty, so the costs then doubled per ton of emissions. And the scheme is also just expected to increase the sectors covered, but the cap on the emissions will get stricter over time. So this is just an example that you can see that eventually the textile industry will directly be impacted by the regulated carbon pricing initiatives. So you can't just decide to pay more for emissions, but at some point the math will just flip and it will actually mean like more cost efficient to emit less. So if we now go on the next slide, in addition to carbon pricing, there's a large increase in the number of environmental and social regulations that are established and that are to be introduced, with quite a few that directly impact the textile industry. Once again, like there are many regulations in place and we'll not like be able to cover all of them. So we'll cover a few of them and we've highlighted the ones that we will cover in orange. But feel free to pop your questions in the Q&A or to contact us later about those. So as we've just mentioned, carbon pricing, in addition to that, there's really like more and more regulations that are requiring entities to disclose and report on their like sustainability related impacts like and performances, but as well as risks. So we have, for example, in California, the Climate Corporate Accountability Act. That one, it requires large companies to disclose like their greenhouse gas emissions. And then in the EU, you have the EU taxonomy that you might have heard of. And that one really like demands from companies and investors to report their sustainable levels of environmental performance regarding climate adaptation and climate change mitigation. So on top of the reporting and disclosure regulations, you also have a lot that's coming regarding circular economy. And that's really gaining so much momentum. For example, in the EU, there's a law that has been established to extend the producer responsibility on post-consumer disposal and treatment of the products. And then more specifically in France, they've actually launched a law that's called the AGEC law. And that one promotes circular economy behaviors across various sectors. And for example, this year, like fashion brands, they are actually forbidden to throw away any unsold goods stemming from ready-to-wear and shoes products. And they have to find solutions to reuse and donate those unsold products, with the recycling, or the option of recycling, being highlighted as the last possible options. So it needs to be either donated or reused before actually being recycled. So there are also, like, in addition to the already established regulation, it's a really like moving environment. So there are a lot of upcoming regulations. And as you might have heard, on Monday, the SEC like sustainability disclosure update has been released, and it's now like open for comments. And the regulation, it notably includes like the mandatory disclosure of emissions generated by a company from its energy use, and the emissions generated by like a company's suppliers and customers might have to be disclosed depending on if they are material to companies. And it covers way more, but like I'm not going to go too much into the details right now, but don't hesitate to ask questions later on. And if we look a bit more on a circular economy area, regarding the extended producer responsibility law that's in the EU, it's actually going to be extended to be more focused on the textile industry and really promote sustainable textile and textile waste management in accordance with all like waste hierarchy, as well as like to support handling of the expected increase in textile collection volumes. So the impact of the textile industry is that all these like environmental regulations, but also the social ones that are already in place and that are actually expected to come in place, they will really bring the necessity of strong like structural changes in business activities to comply to the regulations by, for example, embedding circular economy business models, such as waste management and recycling approaches. But then there's also going to be indirect and direct costs that will increase, such as, for example, as it was mentioned in carbon pricing regulations. And like adapting and changing the business to comply to the regulations, they will incur extra costs. And in addition, there's also like demand shifts and supply shifts for more sustainable practices. And companies are just going to be more and more exposed to reputational risks from just being eco-friendly and taking into account human rights. In this case, mandatory disclosure, for example, will increase the exposure to those risks, as well as the sustainability performance of the company, as it will be publicly available. And it will lead to increased costs as more resources will have to be allocated there. Hence, like it's super important to keep in mind of this like changing environment and to like develop a sustainability strategy and actions, as it will sooner or later impact the textile industry more and more. So I know this was a lot of information, but don't hesitate to ask more questions. But now I will pass you on to Avatar, who will actually speak about putting an internal price on carbon.
Thanks, Milena. And as Milena just mentioned, where the regulatory and compliance carbon pricing are imposed on a company, I'm going to be talking about the voluntary options that companies have to set an internal carbon price now that is specific to their company. So this is one tool that companies can use to prepare for these regulations, as well as to quantify the financial implications of carbon emissions. So on the right, we have the mandated internal carbon price, known as an implicit price, which is what Milena just spoke about. I'm going to be talking about the two on the left, the two voluntary prices. The first one is an internal carbon fee, and this is used by companies to create a fund by contributing a certain amount for each ton of carbon dioxide that they emit annually. And they then use this fund to enable the company to have more emissions reduction efforts, which in turn will help lower their emissions and lower the financial fees that they have to pay every year. The second option, known as a shadow price, is a lot more common. And this is a theoretical price that companies use to help support the financial implications of carbon emissions when they are making long-term business planning and investment strategies. This helps prioritize low carbon investments and prepare for future regulations by enabling companies to determine how much it will cost them if they are looking into a new investment that will greatly increase their emissions. And on the reverse side, it can also show how much savings they will have over time if they invest in a company or a product that has lower and avoided emissions. For the internal carbon fee, these currently range anywhere from $5 to $20 per metric ton of carbon dioxide emissions. And the shadow price has a much larger range, covering anywhere from $200 to $900 per metric ton, although most of those are more than $10. As of 2020, the median internal carbon price set by companies that reported to the CDP, or the Carbon Disclosure Project, was $25. But this is acknowledged to be much lower than what is necessary to align with the Paris Agreement and a 1.5 degree future. So among other benefits, the internal carbon price can really help these companies mitigate the impacts of future mandatory carbon pricing by ensuring that the transition risks of those future compliances are reduced because the company's already incorporated them into the financial structure. It also reduces any future compliance costs and exposure to climate regulations. On top of that, by quantifying the financial implications of new investment decisions or business strategy planning, you are able to determine how much of a cost there will be to either add more emissions or how much of a savings it would be to reduce your emissions. And therefore, that helps incentivize emission reduction activities, which are the most important part of any sustainability strategy, because no matter how much you're willing to pay to cover your emissions, reducing emissions is by far the most robust and the best way to ensure that you're reducing your impact on the environment. And finally, one of the last major benefit is that it can help meet growing stakeholder demands for sustainability actions, because it can show your stakeholders and your shareholders that you are taking climate change seriously and are working to address it by either reducing your emissions or funding projects that are able to reduce your emissions on your behalf. And on the right side, this graph shows the number of companies that have set carbon prices by industry. And as you can see, many companies in resource-intensive industries have already set carbon prices, and they're most common amongst these industries. To give you a few examples of companies that have already implemented and are using a carbon price currently, the first one I have is Microsoft, which uses an internal carbon fee of $15 per metric ton. And they use the revenue from this fee to fund various emissions reduction initiatives, which will hopefully over time ensure that they are able to reduce their emissions effectively and efficiently, while reducing the financial implications of those as well. The second company is Teijin, which is a chemical company based out of Japan. and they use a shadow price of approximately $54 per metric ton. And they use this financial figure when they are making any decisions on capital investment plans or any other decision-making process as a way to determine how much of a financial implication or financial benefit it will be to invest or make any sort of business decision. And the final example I have here is Swiss Re, and they have a hybrid between an internal carbon fee and a shadow price of $100, so by far the highest of the three. And they use the revenue from this fee to kickstart any carbon capture and sequestration technologies, which are known as some of the most robust forms of carbon offsets, which I'm going to be getting into in the next couple slides. And they also use this number as a means to incentivize each division within their company to achieve their net zero target by 2030. And they do this by saying, as you reduce your emissions, you're going to have to pay less of a fee every year to the company. And therefore, that really strives, if they can reduce their emissions, that will cost them less than $100 per metric ton, then that gives them the go ahead and the ability to do it without having to worry about the financial implications of it. And just as a quick refresher, there are two separate types of carbon markets. The compliance or regulated carbon markets is what Milena spoke about in the first section. And the second type is known as the voluntary carbon market. And the voluntary carbon market is where many companies can purchase carbon offsets to achieve carbon neutrality and to reduce their current environmental impacts while they're working to reduce their emissions. And many companies have based their internal carbon prices on the costs of these offsets, and in both the compliance market and the voluntary market, depending on where they're located and if they fall within a current compliance or regulation market. So within the voluntary carbon market, there is a wide range of projects and prices that companies are able to use, depending on the geographical location of your company. You can purchase carbon offsets that range anywhere from around $10 to hundreds of dollars to avoid and remove your emissions from the atmosphere. So the two main types of carbon offsets are carbon avoidance offsets and carbon removal offsets. Before I get into these, I do want to make note that offsets do not substitute for emissions reductions, and they only should be used as a means to reduce your current emissions or your current environmental impacts while you're working to reduce your emissions. Because emissions reductions is an iterative process and happens over time. Unfortunately, it's not an overnight solution, so offsets can be used in the near term to put a Band-Aid over any major impacts you have. So carbon avoidance offsets tend to be less expensive than the carbon removal offsets, and they allow you to financially support projects that prevent additional carbon from being emitted into the atmosphere. The main types of carbon avoidance offsets include renewables, such as solar and wind projects, energy efficiency projects, including supporting the spread of clean cook stoves and boreholes, and finally, deforestation prevention projects, which enable forests and trees to continue to sequester carbon as they would without having to be cut down. And the second type are carbon removal offsets, which are considered more robust and more effective than carbon avoidance offsets, and therefore are more expensive. And these allow you to invest in projects that directly remove or capture carbon from the atmosphere. The three types here are nature-based solution, which include reforestation or planting trees in an area that previously had trees but were cut down, or coastal carbon capture, which is a relatively new technology. And then there's technological solutions such as direct air capture, which allows you to take carbon directly out of the atmosphere and sequester it underground, as well as building materials, which can take that captured carbon from the atmosphere and sequester it within building materials to use. And finally, there are some options such as biochar that combine both nature-based and technological solutions. So this graph here displays the rise in demand over time for carbon credits or carbon offsets. And as you can see, between 2017 and 2020, this demand has more than doubled across all different types. The biggest increase has been in nature-based solutions. So that's the reforestation and the coastal carbon capture, but all different types of carbon offsets we have seen increase over time. And current modeling by the World Bank suggests that this demand could be 10 to 20 times higher by 2030. And with that demand is going to come an increase in price as well. We currently expect prices to rise to around $20 to $50 on average per metric ton of carbon dioxide by 2030. But Trove Research, which is a well-known and well-respected research institute, have said that there's a potential to rise to close to $100 per metric ton by 2030. And similar to demand, this is across all different types of carbon offsets, including avoidance and removal. And now I'm going to pass it off to Kevin to start looking into the near-term sustainability actions that your company can take.
Thank you, Avatar. So once again, to kind of tie all this together, the governments that set regulations surrounding carbon pricing are trying to shift incentives, trying to shift business incentives toward sustainable solutions. And that's not the only reason why companies would start to integrate sustainability within their business, but it is one of the drivers for it. And then the internal carbon pricing that Avatar just mentioned. Again, some of you may have heard of this from within your supply chains or from your peers. Internal carbon pricing is one tool of many that companies have used to better understand their exposure to climate regulations like mandatory carbon pricing, and a way for them to internally shift incentives again towards more sustainable operations and more sustainable and greater integration of sustainability strategy. So what I'll be doing here in the next several slides is talking about what are some of the other tools that companies that generally in starting out on their sustainability journey, what are some of the other tools and approaches that you can use in order to better understand your climate impacts and therefore your exposure to carbon pricing, and how that might tie in as well with other strategies like voluntary carbon pricing. Next slide, please. And at the tail end of that as well, Milena will once again speak. So the solutions I'll be speaking about in the next several minutes are kind of universal. This is what every company should do when trying to understand what regulations and what financial impacts they are exposed to. And then my colleague Milena will speak to a few sustainability strategies that are more specific to the textile industry as well. Next slide, please. So generally speaking, when a company is starting off on a sustainability journey, or also just looking to understand what its exposure is to carbon pricing, especially in the markets in which it operates in, or which its partners operate in, and where pass-through costs might come into effect, the first step is always understanding your own impacts and performing a greenhouse gas inventory or a carbon inventory. This is an annual process where you collect primarily utility data, business travel data, et cetera, and run through certain calculations to get an idea of your carbon emissions. That can then feed into a sustainability report. It can respond to stakeholder demands, and there are a lot of reasons to do this. Purely even speaking on a cost perspective. So the Carbon Disclosure Project, also known as CDP, I'll speak about them again in a few slides. They did a cross-industry study of over 4,000 companies that had started to integrate carbon reduction programs. And because a lot of these analyses reveal which offices, which facilities, which projects and programs are operating efficiently and which are not. Over 33% of projects that were aimed at reducing emissions also reduced costs by at least $100,000. Another 12% of emission saving projects resulted in savings of over $1 million. So there are cost efficiencies to be had through this sort of initiative. On top of that, it's now a key expectation of stakeholder demands, partly from investors and key buyers. Performing a greenhouse gas inventory is an essential piece of any sustainability rating, which is very relevant, especially for listed companies. It's the baseline for any sort of target setting. So if you're trying to demonstrate climate leadership, then you need to understand where your current emissions are in order to set a valid target. And again, it is one of the key pieces for better understanding your exposure to climate-related risks, be they physical from the regions that you operate in, to the financial and what sort of carbon prices you may be exposed to, your partners may be exposed to, your suppliers may be exposed to. Next slide, please. So I also think at this point it's helpful for us to have a shared understanding of a shared glossary, if you will, of what a greenhouse gas inventory is, and the colloquial term is carbon footprint. You may have seen this before, but I think it's important for everyone to understand what goes into a company's carbon profile. And so the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which is sort of the leading document that guides this entire process, breaks carbon emissions down into 3 scopes. The first 2 scopes are your operations, the facilities that you own and operate, really kind of your core business. Scope 1 refers specifically to sources that are owned by the company or from emissions that occur on site. So any fuels that are combusted on site, we're talking primarily natural gas, diesel, propane, gasoline, et cetera. Scope 2 really refers primarily to purchased electricity. And so both of those together comprise your operations. Scope 3 emissions, which are becoming increasingly relevant for reporting, are your supply chain. And that means both upstream, so the facilities that may be leased, business travel, anything coming from your suppliers, employee commuting, and downstream means anything that you produce, that you create, and its climate impacts on customers and end of life. So that could be processing, end of use of, and end of life of sold products, for example. Next slide, please. And so the reason that I wanted to break out Scope 3 and really discuss what this is because in a lot of initial disclosure requirements, both by the private sector and increasingly by governments, companies historically have been expected to measure their Scope 1 and 2 emissions, their operational emissions, if you will, and disclose on that. But there are increasing stakeholder expectations for companies to also disclose on Scope 3. And this chart from a McKinsey report from a few years ago is a key reason why, which is simply for a lot of industries, especially resource-intensive industries like the textile industry, the emissions associated with your supply chain, the use of your products, and the sourcing of your materials are much larger than the climate impacts of just your company. Where you choose to spend your money and how you choose to design your products has outsized influence. Again, this McKinsey study showed that on average, for a company in the textile industry, your supply chain emissions are 4.2 times greater than those of your direct operations. So while it may not always be an immediate requirement of the regulatory jurisdiction that you are based in, is increasingly becoming so. In fact, the US SEC guidance that was just published on Monday specifically mentions that companies will need to phase in Scope 3 reporting. Again, it's also a key request from investors as well. And from a pure impact perspective, we heavily recommend that you also consider what categories of your supply chain emissions would be relevant to you. Next slide, please. Now, one of the challenges that companies often face is that when companies are thinking through how to reduce their carbon footprint and therefore reduce their exposure to carbon pricing, companies generally more intuitively understand how to work on their own emissions. It means operating more efficiently, using less fuel, switching to renewable energy, and all of that is very valid and the right approach. Companies have a harder time oftentimes understanding how to address the emissions within their supply chains. And so especially when working with suppliers, we recommend one of 2 approaches. They're not mutually exclusive, but one may be more appropriate than the other depending on what your category, what your spend profile may be. And essentially the 2 approaches that we would recommend in terms of working with your suppliers on their own climate impacts and therefore reducing your own exposure. If you have a lot of the same suppliers year over year and long-standing relationships, and especially your spend profile, there are a few big, it's top heavy, there are a few big suppliers, then we recommend working with your existing partners, educating them, bringing them on board, having them understand that sustainability is an increasing priority for your company, and essentially encouraging them over time to measure and disclose their own emissions and reduce their own emissions, by which means you reduce your own exposure. If there's a lot of turnover within your supplier spend, then we would recommend instead adopting a more process-driven approach, where you're integrating sustainability language into contracts, requests for proposals, requests for information, so that these criteria apply to all suppliers, especially all new suppliers, and this gets integrated over time. Next slide, please. So again, the baseline for understanding what sort of exposure, what sort of impacts you have on climate and what your exposure is to carbon pricing stems from conducting a greenhouse gas inventory and understanding your own emissions profile. Once you've done that, then it's very common, and we as consultants would recommend that you consider disclosing that publicly, so that you can report on this year over year. And the most widespread tool for this is the Carbon Disclosure Project, or CDP. It's a leading framework for voluntary disclosure and also a key piece of how companies engage their suppliers on their own climate impacts. Some of you may have already been exposed to CDP questionnaires on your own impacts. So investors use this for investment decision making. Companies use this in order to secure access to capital flows. And as you'll see, a lot of major buyers in both the retail space and in the textile and furniture industries already use CDP and already use CDP not only to report on their own emissions and their supply chain emissions, but also to engage their suppliers on climate change. So that includes IKEA, Williams-Sonoma, Etsy, Lenzing, and several others. It is by far the most widespread platform for this. And so once you have measured your emissions, this would be a key next step, would be to disclose that publicly so that your stakeholders understand where you are in your journey and that you're taking this seriously. Next slide, please. Another key component is once you've measured your emissions, then in order to take the next step, you would want to set a target to reduce those. And there are a lot of frameworks listed here at the bottom that we're not going to have time to get into detail in this webinar, although I'll be happy to answer questions about them in the Q&A. But just generally speaking, there are kind of three approaches that companies can take on setting a climate target. The first is an absolute target. It's the most intuitive. We as a company commit to reducing our operational emissions, our scope 1 and 2 emissions by 40% in the next 10 years from a 2020 baseline. Generally, that's fairly straightforward. Intensity targets are more appropriate for companies that expect to grow very quickly in the next few years, where they're not sure about how easily they'll be able to achieve absolute reductions. And so they condition that on a unit basis. We're going to commit to reducing our emissions by 30% per full-time employee, or by 30% per unit of revenue by a certain target year. And so that conditions that those emissions reductions while acknowledging that there is the expectation of significant growth in the next few years. And then finally, when engaging your suppliers, certainly plenty of companies have just asked their suppliers to reduce their own emissions by a certain amount and show progress in that way. But companies can also just set an engagement target and say, by 2025, we are committing that our top 40% of suppliers by spend will have set their own climate targets, or will have committed to reporting and reducing their own emissions by a certain amount. So that's just another approach that is available to companies. And again, a combination of targets may align you with a number of sustainability frameworks, some of which are listed here below. Next slide. As a last point, before I hand it back off to my colleague Milena, I want to quickly mention TCFD, which again, the acronym stands for Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, which is a mouthful. But the key takeaway here is that this is a framework for reporting climate risks and opportunities that is becoming increasingly mandated by certain jurisdictions. So the UK a few years ago passed a law making this mandatory for companies over a certain size. And then the US SEC guidance that came out just 2 days ago is now requesting that companies report on their identified climate risks in their annual reports, in their 10Ks. And so we know that this is going to become increasingly prevalent. And just so that you understand kind of what is coming down the pipeline, there are 11 disclosure recommendations, and it's essentially asking you to consider, how do climate risks impact my business in the short term, medium term, long term timeframes? And what sort of climate opportunities can I identify? How will I, do I have a resilience plan in place? How can I communicate to my stakeholders that we have a strategy in place to respond to the world as it is evolving? So with that, I'll pass it on to my colleague Milena, who can speak to some of the solutions more specific to the textile industry. But again, all of these are very useful early steps in your sustainability journey.
Great, thank you, Kevin. So I'm going to talk a bit more about like textile specific sustainability actions. The first one being the use of sustainability standards to increase the traceability and also the transparency of your value chain. So today, the majority of like top apparel and textile brands, they have sustainable material targets. However, there's only a third of them that actually tries their value chain, with only half of them actually having a true visibility on their tier 1 suppliers. So using sustainability standards, it really enables to like monitor, but also verify product sustainability claims on a site, transaction, and physical material levels. And it really like provides the ability to map the materials value chain, which in turn really like enables you to track the progress towards your sustainability goals. And as you can see on the right-hand side of the slide, in the past year, the actual number of certified sites have been increasing. And so the top graph actually shows the amount of sites that have been certified by the Global Organic Textile Standards, also known as GOTS. And it's the worldwide leading textile processing standard for organic fibers that includes ecological and social criteria. And it's also backed up by like independent certification of the entire supply chain. And then the second one at the bottom, which also shows an increase of their certification, but this time of the Global Recycle Standards. And this one, it's a standard that sets requirements for third-party certification of like recycled content, chain of custody, social and like environmental performance practices, and also like chemical restrictions. And so following this on the next slide, like a key action is really to switch to sustainable textile and recycled fabrics. So the global fiber production is really increasing exponentially, and it's just expected to continue to increase further. And that will incur like more emissions. And the majority of the global fiber market is composed of fossil-based textile, such as like polyester. And there's actually a very small proportion that is actually organic or sustainable or from like recycled, is recognized by like well-known programs, such as the ones I've previously mentioned. So it's with most of like the emissions coming from raw materials, a switch to sustainable and recycled fabrics is really crucial to decarbonizing the sector. And onto the next slide, this follows with the fact that it's quite important to integrate like eco-design and circular economy principles to first like eliminate waste and pollution, keep your products and material in use, and regenerate natural system. And this relies on like the famous 3Rs approach that you've probably heard about. But it stands for reduce, reuse, and recycle. So like such as designing and manufacturing products in a way that it can be like easily disassembled or like reused or recycled. And also like to try to increase industrial flexibility by, for example, reducing like inventory excess and minimize waste, or like donate or up and down cycle leftovers, as well as in addition, promoting and integrating regenerative agriculture approaches such as agroforestry. And then on a more energy related side, like the transition to renewable energy can really make a substantial difference. Like more than 70% of the textile industry's emissions come from upstream activities, such as from energy intensive raw material production, preparation, and processing. And then more on like a transportation side, for like the shipment and the procurement of goods, it's good to substitute air transport by maritime transport where it's possible, as like air transport, it produces on average 20 to 30 times more than maritime transport per ton of freight per kilometer of transportation. So this is the end of the presentation. I know it's a lot of information, but hopefully it has given you a grasp of why it's important to really get ahead of the curve and decarbonize your activities, but also how to integrate more sustainability actions. So feel free to ask your questions during the Q&A session or to contact us later. Thank you.
All right, thank you all. That was a lot of information. You did a great job of making it digestible for us. Let's see, we have a couple of questions. All right, so the first question, how do companies decide how much their internal carbon price should be?
Yeah, I can take that one. So for the most part, many companies base their internal carbon price on the current price of carbon offsets. So they look at the average price of avoidance offsets, which is currently around $10, and then the average price of removal offsets, which is currently around $50. And they look at whether they tend to pick a number between those two averages so they can have a mix of both avoidance and removal offsets. And then they use that price to align with the actual price of emissions if they are in a voluntary carbon market. And if they're in a regulated carbon market, the price is imposed on them, so they don't have as much of a choice.
Okay. All right, thank you. Thank you for that. The next question, so my company sits at the bottom of the supply chain. We're suppliers, not buyers. What should we be doing?
I'm happy to field that one. So if for companies sitting at the bottom of the supply chain, most of their impacts will be either operational or downstream in the use of their products. So the first is to understand the landscape of what the stakeholder expectations are on your company, understand what you're expected to report to, particularly if you're operating in jurisdictions which now have either existing carbon pricing mechanisms or are expected to do so in the next few years. Especially because the textile industry is considered a resource-intensive industry. But really there, it's some of the recommendations that Milena spoke about towards the end of integrating sustainable materials, because again, the use of your products as considering your position and within the supply chain will have really significant downstream impacts and pass-through impacts. And so there will be a lot of stakeholder expectation on you as a original source provider.
Okay, thank you, Kevin. Let's see. Okay, let me take one from the chat. So are companies starting to nearshore their production to reduce their shipping emissions? And as a secondary question, are these carbon taxes going to accelerate sourcing changes?
I'm happy to take that one as well. So far, we have, because the shipping sector has only been directly impacted by a few jurisdictions in terms of carbon pricing, I haven't seen that shift happen quite yet. Although again, as these regulations take on more sectors, we do expect that shipping will be encompassed within a number of carbon pricing schemes within the next few years. However, in terms of carbon taxes going to accelerate sourcing changes, that really depends on the degree to which the degree to which the extra imposed cost changes the underlying financials of the decision makers of buyers. On one hand, as Carrie mentioned, customers are generally willing, end use customers are generally willing to pay a premium for goods that they know are sustainable. And to some degree, if that expectation passes through to major buyers, then buyers will have an incentive to ensure that they are sourcing from companies that are operating in jurisdictions where carbon pricing is in effect, because then they generally know that companies have an incentive to reduce their emissions. But at the end of the day, keep in mind that the existence of a carbon tax does not inherently mean that a company is performing more sustainably. It means that it can either perform more sustainably or pay a premium to continue operating as it once did. And so it will, I have no doubt it will influence the decision-making of buyers, but it's not the only criteria.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. Let's see, I'll go to another question. I understand that my company needs to start measuring its emissions. How should we get started, and what scope 3 categories should I consider?
Again, excellent question. So it's certainly easier to understand, first off, within your operations. It's getting the lay of land of what facilities do we own and lease, what company-owned vehicles are in operation. Anything that is kind of within your operational control is something that you would want to start assessing the energy use of. And so for most companies, no matter where they sit in the supply chain, we're talking about utility bills and invoices, and using energy consumption figures from that or from vehicles to get an idea of your fuel consumption, and then estimating carbon emissions from there. There are all sorts of methodologies for this that you can find online, or consultancies like Agendi that help companies perform this. For scope 3, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol has 15 categories, some of which are more relevant for some companies than others. For example, companies in heavy manufacturing may not consider investments to be particularly relevant. Similarly, companies at the bottom of the supply chain may not consider upstream emissions to be particularly relevant, and downstream use of products is much more relevant. So what we would recommend, and per the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, would be to look at the list of emissions categories and have a conversation with your finance department and try to get a sense of which of these do we think are significant pieces of our business proposition. Where is it that we sit? Do we have a lot of investment? Do we have a significant spend, or are we more geared towards customers and downstream? And try to understand which are most relevant to your business.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. All right, what online tools do you recommend for calculating scope 1 emissions and scope 2?
Online tools, I know that there are carbon calculators out there. We don't really make use of them ourselves because it's in our business to do much more detailed assessments. It's a good question. Honestly, I'll have to check with my team about the most relevant online tools and get back to you.
Okay. Okay. Got one more question. If mandatory carbon markets are expected to become more prevalent in the future, why is demand for voluntary carbon credits also expected to increase?
I can take that one. The voluntary carbon credits, those are also expected to increase because the number of companies that are working to achieve carbon neutrality or net zero are incorporating them into their strategies. And not all of these companies will be under those new compliance and regulated markets. So as those companies expand their strategies, as well as engage their suppliers to start measuring, reducing, and offsetting their own emissions, that will cause that decrease that we're expected to see up until 2030, and I'm sure will continue through 2030 as well.
I can also add on that part of the calculus is that companies that know that right now they're operating in jurisdictions where carbon, either carbon tax or carbon cap and trade scheme only affects them indirectly through pass-on costs from their suppliers or from their utility providers. The companies are doing a calculus knowing that these regulations will expand in scope to cover resource-intensive industries. And so they know that they're going to have to pay a direct cost on carbon within a few years. And so internal carbon pricing is a tool that some companies use to prepare themselves for that and say, okay, we're going to pay an upfront fee for carbon now, even though it's voluntary, because the proceeds of that fee will help us decarbonize, so that by the time that the regulatory scheme covers our industry directly, our emissions will be substantially lower because we will have already invested in decarbonization tools in the last few years.
Okay, thank you. All right, so I have another question. So when a company comes to you, if they have done some of their own calculations, does that create any efficiencies in the service you are able to provide them?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Sorry, that was a bit flippant, but no, we absolutely we are used to using the data that we are provided and applying best possible methodologies based on the actual impacts that your business has. But any data that's provided to us upfront just helps provide context.
Okay. And anybody has any additional questions? We have a couple of minutes. Oh, actually, we don't. We're kind of over time. But well, then let me just say thank you all for joining us today, and a special thanks to our speakers. Again, we'll share this deck following the presentation. And I encourage you to please reach out to one of our speakers if you're interested in learning more about current and future carbon regulations, or having Jenny support you on your sustainability journey. Again, I encourage you to register for Showtime and check out our new website, which is in the chat, and be on the lookout for additional, sustainability themed webinars as part of an ongoing series. Thank you for joining us, and thank you to the Agendi team. Have a good afternoon.
Thanks for your time, everyone.